Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the OSA's Volunteer Screening webinar. Before we officially begin, I would like to give you the Reader's Digest version of how we arrived at tonight's webinar. We began in 1998 with a request from Volunteer Canada to be a pilot project for volunteer screening. The OSA, along with the Burlington Soccer Club, worked together for over 5 years to the point where screening was mandatory for the competitive sector in 2003, and by 2004 all team officials were to be screened. 10 short years later, in 2014, we did a much-needed review of the handbook. With the help of Stephen Indig of Sport Law and Strategy Group and the OSA's newly created Risk Management Committee, this is where we landed with a living document that sits in the areas of risk management and clubs on the OSA's website. As for tonight's presentation, as you can see from the agenda, there are 3 topics I would like to review. The updated handbook, since its release in early May, review of the confidentiality process, and review of the steps 1 to 10 of the Volunteer Screening Handbook. Tonight we will not discuss the position definitions. These documents are for your reference. You can change them as you see fit. But by all means, feel free to contact me if you have any questions regarding these documents. Number 1 on our agenda is the changes that have been made to the handbook since it was released in early May. On page 3, we added clarification as to who is included in the OSA, that being districts, clubs, leagues, and academies. The OSA requires screening of all team officials. The way that I best understand the term team officials is anyone who sits on a bench. All team officials are screened at either a high or low risk level. You will have noticed that we have removed the middle risk level. Also on page 3, the section Why Screen was rewritten for clarity, with emphasis on, number 1, improving the quality and safety of programs and services. Number 2, reducing risk and liability. Number 3, better matching people's skills and experience to the needs within the organization. For example, appointing an experienced under-8 coach with under-8 players rather than placing an experienced successful adult coach with under-8 players. On page 4, which is step 1, assessment, we have changed the terminology in an effort to again clarify what is high risk and what is low risk. We have done this by adding the term traveling teams, which clearly identifies the difference between high and low risk. If all players, parents, and team officials stay at the same field every week, that is a low risk. We have added new screening measures. To the high risk level, we have added mandatory vulnerable records checks and performance reviews. To low risk, we have added the basic registration form and the disclosure form. I understand that a lot of organizations use their basic registration form through AIMS, simply because it serves a purpose and no additional work is required. This is great. But for applications for high risk, they should be specific to each organization's needs. For example, does this position require an A license or B license or respect in soccer? Agenda item number 2 is confidentiality. As you know from the past, it is up to the organization to protect personal information that is gathered. I thought it would be beneficial tonight to review a few key points. All organizations should have procedures that, number 1, identify who will have access to personal information. For example, only the selection panel. If the organization keeps the police records checks, or is it returned to the individual? The OSA highly recommends returning all personal documents to the applicant, in particular the PRCs, and especially if there are any infractions. State that the information received through the screening process will only be used to determine if the applicant is suitable for a team official position. For example, you would not use this information for or against anyone involved in a discipline case. Number 4, identify where confidential information will be stored, for example, in a locked cabinet. State that the soccer organization will take all reasonable steps to protect personal information. Number 6, identify how long the soccer organization will keep confidential information. Number 7, explain in what circumstances and with whom the information will be discussed and why. For example, The only people who will see a PRC with a questionable infraction is the special committee. One point I would like to make is that it is not advisable for a board of directors of an organization to be the final reviewers of the applications, especially those that have infractions on their PRCs. When this practice is carried out, organizations run a very high risk of having personal information released to the public. Once the information is out, there is no going back, and this practice could be very damaging to both the individual and the organization. It is better to have a small skill set committee set up to address any issues that arise because of infractions. The board of directors should receive information as to which team officials were appointed, but really it should be for their information, not for their approval. Approval is done with either the selection panel that reviews the majority of the applications or the special screening panel that would review questionable applications. Agenda item number 3, the 10 steps of volunteer screening. We have already reviewed this section, step 1, assessment, but I'm going to repeat them anyways just for clarity. 1, there is no longer a middle level risk. The key indicator as to whether a risk is high or low is the term traveling. The added screening measures to the high-risk area are the vulnerable police records checks and the performance reviews, which are now mandatory. Added to the low-risk measure are the registration form and the disclosure form, which is Appendix C. Step 2, position assignment. Soccer organizations should review each position with the adapt the content to be specific to their organization. Again, for example, the level of coach's experience should coincide with the level of the player. Step 3, recruitment. Recruitment should be planned, communicated, and equal for everyone. Screening should be explained to all levels of the organization. For example, when speaking with an applicant, let them know that they will be expected to get a vulnerable police record check if they want to coach a team that travels. Step 4, the application. For low risk, again, I understand that a lot of organizations use their general registration form rather than create a new one. The registration form has all the necessary information. Again, this is great. For high risk, the application should be created to be specific to that position. For example, the requirements are a B license, respect in soccer, and making ethical decisions. Step 5, the interview. Choose your skill-based panel from a set of terms of reference. It should include things like what is their role, how far can they go in selecting or not selecting an applicant. The terms of reference may also include technical expertise, knowledge of the soccer organization's policies, human resource experience, and ideally screening techniques. The interview process is outlined in the handbook quite clearly. We suggest you ask questions using the following examples. The definitional questions. What is the organization's code of conduct? Do they know of it and understand it? The casual question. What happens when a volunteer violates the code of conduct? The hypothetical question. What would you do if you were accused of violating the code of conduct? And number 4, the situational question. Here's the situation. What would you do? The answers you receive to this type of varied questioning can tell a lot about a person. How would they handle the situation where they themselves are accused of breaching the code of conduct policy? And how would their actions compare to the way they might handle a player breaching the same policy? Do they have a different standard for themselves than for the player? Step 6, references. Again, this area in the handbook is quite clear, and Appendix G provides a sample script. Please do check references. You never know what you might find out. We realize that applicants provide references that will speak highly of them, but again, if questions are asked in a particular way, you might receive a very different point of view. Step 7, police records checks. One main point I would like to make here is, remember, this is only one tool in your volunteer screening toolbox. When screening, you need to look at the whole picture of the individual and take into consideration the interview, the police records check, and the references. Have in place in the event an infraction appears on a PRC. Have a plan in place in the event an infraction appears on the PRC. This is where your additional special committee will review applications with questionable infractions. Not ones that are clearly not acceptable, for example, sexual offense, but ones that may fall within a gray area and the main selection panel is not able to make a decision. We do not recommend that this type of situation go before the board of directors for a decision. Confidentiality may be compromised, as mentioned earlier. If a decision is made to accept an applicant, or if an applicant is not accepted because of the information received on the PRC, the applicant should be told, and the PRCs are returned to the applicant. In either case, both the decision and the discussion should be documented. The OSA suggests that every 3 years a new PRC is obtained, unless the person leaves the organization and wants to return after a time away during that same 3-year period. Please remember, police record checks are only as good as the day they are received. There could be a situation where someone is being charged the day before you are viewing their PRC and the charge will not appear. Again, this is why we need to look at the complete picture of the individual. Step 8, orientation and training. Obviously, this is a great practice. All staff need to be familiar with the organization's policies, whether it's your code of conduct, social media guide, or the screening handbook. Team officials need to know what is expected of them. This can be easily completed through an orientation and training session. Step 9, support, supervision, and evaluation. We all want the team officials and the players to succeed. One way to achieve this is to have regular evaluations of the team officials, not only when there is a problem. Everyone should be aware of the evaluation process, including players, parents, and team officials. Players and parents should also be aware that if they encounter an issue with a team official, what is the proper process for them to follow? Last but not least, step 10, follow-up and feedback. Everyone wants to know how they are doing. It is a good practice to provide feedback to team officials and provide them with a copy of that feedback and any necessary follow-up. This brings our presentation to a conclusion. We are ready for questions, suggestions, or comments.